Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here in front of you all again. In my last lecture yesterday, I set out to show how skilled practice lies not in the mechanical application of rules and representations that have already been transmitted, but in a precise correspondence brought out through the coordination of perception and action between the movements of the practitioner and movements in the world. And in this sense I argued that the practitioner is a wayfarer whose task it is to follow a path. And in this lecture I want to focus on the last of the 5 propositions that I introduced at the outset. Namely, that this path following is given not in an engagement between practitioners and the material world, by way of the senses, but in the coupling of substantial flows and sensory awareness in a world of materials. In his notebook, the artist, Paul Klee, repeatedly urged that the processes of genesis and growth that give rise to forms in the world we inhabit are more important than the forms themselves. Form is the end, death, Pelo. Form giving is movement, action. Form giving is life. And this, in turn, lay at the heart of Klee's celebrated creative credo of 1920, which went, "Art does not reproduce the visible, but makes visible." It does not, in other words, seek to replicate finished forms that are already settled, whether as images in the mind or as objects in the world. It seeks rather to join with those very forces that bring form into being. So the line grows from a point that has been set in motion, just as the plant grows from its seed. And taking their cue from Paul Klee, the philosophers, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, argue that the essential relation in a world of life is not between matter and form, but between materials and forces. It's about the way in which substances of all sorts, enlivened by cosmic forces and with variable properties, mix and meld with one another in the generation of things. So whenever we encounter matter, as Deleuze and Guattari insist, it is matter in movement, in flux, in variation. And the consequence, they go on to assert, is that this matter flow can only be followed. Now, what Deleuze and Guattari call matter flow, I would call material. And accordingly, I recast the assertion as a simple rule of thumb to follow the materials. And to apply this rule is to intervene in a world that is, so to speak, continually on the boil. Perhaps the world could be compared to a huge kitchen. In the kitchen, stuff is mixed in various combinations, generating new materials in the process, which in turn become mixed with other ingredients in an endless process of transformation. Suppose containers have to be opened and their contents poured out. We have to take the lids off things. And faced with the anarchic proclivities of his or her materials, the cook has to struggle to retain some semblance of control over what is going on. An even closer parallel might be drawn with the laboratory of the alchemist. The world of alchemy, as the art historian James Elkins explains, was not one of matter that might be described according to the principles of its molecular composition, but one of substances which were known by what they look and feel like, and by following what happens to them as they are mixed together, heated or cooled. Alchemy, writes Elkins, is the old science of struggling with materials and not quite understanding what is happening. And his point is that this too is what painters have always done. Their knowledge was also one of substances, and these were often little different from those of the alchemical laboratory. So as practitioners, the cook, the alchemist, and the painter are not so much imposing form on matter as bringing together diverse materials and combining or redirecting their flow in the anticipation of what might emerge. Now, much has been written in recent years on the relations between persons and things, guided by the thought that the material world is not passively subservient to human desires. But theorists have expressed this by appeal not to the vitality of materials, but to the agency of objects. If persons can act on objects in their vicinity, so it is argued, objects can act back, causing persons to do what they otherwise might not. The speed bump on the road, to take a familiar example that's used by Bruno Latour, causes the driver to slow down, and its agency here substitutes for that of the policeman. We might stare at an object, explains Elkins with acknowledgement of the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan, but the object also stares back at us, so that our vision is caught in what he calls a cat's cradle of crossing lines of sight. And in a precise reversal of conventional subject-object relations, the archaeologist Chris Gosden suggests that in many cases it is not the mind that imposes its forms on material objects, but rather material objects that give shape to the forms of thought. But in this endless shuttling back and forth between the mind and the material world, it seems that objects can act like subjects, and that subjects can be acted upon like objects. So instead of subjects and objects, there are quasi-objects and quasi-subjects connected in relational networks. And yet, paradoxically, these attempts to move beyond the modernist polarization of subject and object remain trapped within a language of causation that is founded on the very same grammatical categories, and that can only conceive of action as an effect set in train by an agent. At best, I think, these lead only to contradiction and confusion. At worst, they have led theorists to make fools of themselves in ways that we would be ill-advised to emulate. I refer to an earlier discussion on whether cat facts have agency. For the world we inhabit, I maintain, is not comprised of subjects and objects, or even of quasi-subjects and quasi-objects. The problem lies not so much in the sub or the of, or in the dichotomy between them, as in the jet, means thrown. Because the constituents of this world are not already thrown or cast before they can act or be acted upon. They are in the throwing or in the casting. This is the point that I think can best be illustrated by means of a simple experiment that I carried out with my students at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Using fabric, matchstick bamboo, ribbon, tape, glue and twine, and working indoors on tables, we each made a kite. It seemed as though we were assembling an object. But as soon as we carried our creations outside, they leapt into action, twirling, spinning, nose-diving, and just occasionally flying. How did this happen? Had some animating principle magically jumped into the kites, causing them to act in what way, most often in ways we did not intend? Were we witnessing in their unruly behaviour the consequences of an interaction between, in each case, a person, the flyer, and an object, the kite, which could only be explained by imagining that the kite had acquired an agency capable of counteracting that of the flyer? Let me just draw a picture to show what I mean. So here is the ground, Here is the flyer. Here is the kite. Which way is the wind going? With the tail. There. And here, from the hand, from the bottom of the kite, is a line. So you might think that the kite is flying, so the kite's got some agency and it's going this way, and the person here has got some agency and it's pulling this way, and the line then is a line of interaction between the kite and the flyer. So you have an interaction between an object, the kite, that is behaving like an agent, and a person, the flyer, that is behaving like an agent. Is that how we explain it? Of course not. The kites behaved in the way they did because at the moment we went indoors, they were swept up, as indeed we were ourselves, in those currents of air that we call the wind. So there's something else going on, namely the wind that was, I don't know how you, blowing along. So the kite that lay lifeless on the table indoors, now immersed in those generative currents, had come to life. So what we had thought to be an object was revealed as what I would call a thing. And the thing about things, if you will, is that far from standing before us as a fait accompli, completed itself, each is a going on. Or better, a place where several goings-on become entwined. Or as the philosopher Martin Heidegger put it, albeit rather enigmatically, the thing presents itself in its thingy from out of the worldly world. It's a particular gathering together of materials in movement. So that means the very thinginess of the kite lies in the way it gathers the wind into its fabric and in its swooping describes an ongoing line of flight. Now, on no account should this line of flight be confused with the line connecting the kite with the flyer. Remember, this is the line connecting the kite with the flyer, but the line of flight is going along between them that way. It's the wind. Because the line of flight, as Deleuze and Guattari insist, does not connect. It is, and I just quote, it is not defined by the points it connects, or by the points that compose it. On the contrary, it passes between points. It comes up through the middle. A becoming is neither one nor two, nor the relation of the two. It is the in-between, the line of flight running perpendicular to both. And in a footnote they have a little picture, a little diagram that explains it. They would imagine an object A and an object B. And this is the connection between A and B. But the line of flight is going down there, pulling away at each side. One could imagine, say, the water of a river. You could suppose that A and B are places on two sides of a river, and you could build a bridge and travel from A to B, but the water is going in the direction orthogonal to the line connecting A and B, and the water doesn't connect anything to anything else. So like the stems of plants growing from their seeds, to return to Paul Clay's image, such lines trace the paths of the world's becoming. It's worldly, as Heidegger says, rather than connecting up in reverse sequences of points already traversed. Okay, so the line of flight is simply carrying on. I could, if I wanted, say, well, there's a line. Let's say that it's gone through this point, this point, this point, and this point. I could then plot the line backwards and say, connect them up. That I can only connect them up by looking backwards on the route already travelled. So that's why I prefer the word meshwork to network to describe what Laurent saw as the ensemble of movements within which skilled practice is carried on. Think of the mesh of vegetation in the forest or of roots underground, each of which seeks to carry on by seeking a way through the tangle. The lines we're dealing with are not lines of connection, they're lines of growth. Now, what goes for the kite in the air, in its thingy, also goes for the flyer on the ground. If the kite is not endowed with an agency that causes it to act, then neither is the human flyer. Like the kite, the human is not a being that acts. The human is not an agent, but what I called yesterday a hive of activity, energized by the flows of materials, including the currents of air, that course through the body and through processes of respiration and metabolism, keep it alive. Like the kite's line of flight, so the life trajectory of the flyer follows a course orthogonal to any line we might draw connecting the kite as quasi-object with the flyer as quasi-subject. In practice then, flyer and kite should be understood not as interacting entities, alternately playing agent to the other as patient, but as trajectories of movement responding to one another in counterpoint, alternately as melody and refrain. In short, these contrapuntal trajectories proceed in correspondence, like melodic lines on a musical stage. Now, both flyer and kite, in this sense, are things. Indeed, persons are things too. There's no opposition between persons and things, because a person is a kind of a thing. As a hive of activity and an entanglement of material flows, every person is a living organism. So we don't have to conjure up an additional capacity installed within the organism to stand in as the cause of this activity, as though the activity were the effect of some internal agency. Indeed, the problem of agency, about which theorists have had very much to say recently, is one that they have largely created for themselves, born of the attempt to reanimate a world already rendered lifeless by an exclusive focus on the objectness of things. It's striking to me that the more that theorists have to say about agency, the less they seem to have to say about life. To rewrite the life of things as the agency of objects is to effect a double reduction of things to objects and of life to agents. And what I want to do is to reverse this reduction, to restore things to life, and in so doing, to celebrate the creativity of what Plato called form giving. Now, to achieve this aim, it's necessary to overcome a tendency to which I referred in my last lecture, to read creativity backwards from the novelty of outcomes to ideas in the minds of individual agents to which these outcomes are supposed to give material expression. You'll recall that this attribution of the final form of the work to an initial idea or intention in the mind of the maker is what anthropologist Alfred Gell called the abduction of agency. Every work of art, for Gell, is an object that, and I quote, that can be related to a social agent in a distinctive art-like way. And by art-like, Gell means a situation in which it is possible to trace a chain of causal connections running from the object to the agent, whereby the former, the object, may be said to index the latter, the agent. So it's like this. Suppose you have an artwork here, and suppose we have the artist here, and you say, well, this is the artwork. We will then trace back from the finished artwork to an idea in the mind of this artist who then produced it. So you abduct agency from the artwork to the artist, working backwards from the result to what is supposed to be the cause. So, to trace these connections, to look through the work to the agency behind it, is to perform the cognitive operations of abduction. Now, from the argument I've already set out, it should be clear why I think this view to be fundamentally mistaken. It is wrong. A work of art, I would insist, is not an object, but a thing. And as Clay argued, the role of the artist, as that of any skilled practitioner, is not to give effect to a preconceived idea, whether it's novel or not, but to join with and follow the forces and flows of material that bring the form of the work into being. The work invites the viewer to join the artist as a fellow traveller, to look with it as it unfolds in the world, rather than to look behind it to an originating intention of which it is the final product. In a dialogue with his son Yves, himself a practicing artist, the novelist and critic John Berger observes that you cannot be a mountain, or a buzzard soaring in the sky, or a tree in the forest, but you can become one by aligning your own movements and gestures with those of the thing that captures your attention. This is what happens, for example, in the practice of drawing, which Clay famously characterized as taking a line for a walk. You know, Clay's famous. You take a line for a walk. That's the line is traced of that movement. Like the mountain path, the buzzard's flight, or the tree route, that drawn line does not connect predetermined points in sequence, but launches forth from its tip, leaving a trail behind it. So, where the path winds, the bird flies, and the route creeps, the line follows. But following, as Deleuze and Guattari observed, is not at all the same thing as reproducing. Whereas reproducing involves the procedure of iteration, repeating, following involves itineration. Practitioners, as I argued in the last lecture, are itineraries, whose works are consubstantial with the trajectories of their own lives. And it's in the very forward movement of improvisation, rather than the retrospective work of abduction, that the creativity of their practice is to be found. To improvise, write Deleuze and Guattari, is to join with the world, or to meld with it. And I like this. One ventures from home on the thread that tunes. Life, to Deleuze and Guattari, issues along such thread lines. They are the lines of flight that I've already described in our earlier example of the kite. Along them, points are not connected up so much as swept up and rendered indiscernible in the current of movement. Life, as I've already indicated, is open-ended. Its impulse is not to reach a terminus, an end point, but to keep on going. Now, following, that is, aligning one's movements with the trajectories of things in the world, following calls for observation. But this is not the distance and disinterested contemplation of a world of objects, nor does it result in the formation of mental images or representations. To observe is not so much to see what is out there as to watch what is going on. Its aim is not to represent the observed, but to participate with it in the same generative movement, intimately coupling the movement of the observer's attention, whether visual, oral, haptic, or olfactory, with currents of activity in the environment. Earlier I referred to much recent writing on persons and things which suggests that agency is not exclusive to persons, but distributed in interactive networks in which objects can act like subjects and such subjects can be acted upon like objects. Is there no more in the world then than these subject-objects and object-subjects? In supposing that such entities comprise all there is, theorists of material culture envisage a world in which the die is already cast, a world that has already precipitated out from the currents, mixtures, and transmutations of substances from which they are formed. To follow the materials, however, is to enter a world in formation, in which things appear not as bounded objects, but as confluences of materials that have momentarily melded into recognizable forms. So far from containing the materials from which they are formed, things leak, and are only sustained because of the interchange of materials across their surfaces. It's because of these fluxes that the inhabited world is imbued with life. So in shifting our focus from ready-made objects to processes of generation and dissolution, I believe we should attend not to the materiality of things, but to materials becoming things. Whereas objects exist, everything, as I've already shown, is a going on, or better, a place where many goings on get tangled up together. And to engage with things, I maintain, you have to join with them in the processes of their formation. In my last lecture, I referred to Yu Yan's work on Chinese calligraphy. One cannot observe a work of calligraphy, Yan explains, let alone understand its meaning, merely by staring at it, which is what Western art goers are accustomed to do. They see it on the wall and they look at it and wonder what they're supposed to see. One has to enter into it and to join with the calligrapher in his or her ink traces. Anthropologist and craftsperson Stephanie Bunn has said much the same about understanding pattern, for example in knotwork, knitting and basketry. We may see the pattern in our mind's eye, but we do it, we know it, we embrace it through the movement of our bodies. And it's similar with patterning in music. On a purely intellectual level, it might be possible to apprehend, say, one of Bach's suites for unaccompanied cello as a complete, perfectly formed structure. There it is. But as a practicing cellist, I cannot listen to a performance without feeling the music flowing through my body, arms, and fingers as if I were playing it myself. And so to listen is to unite the process of one's own kinesthetic attention with the trajectory of sound. Now, I'm going to illustrate this argument by playing myself. I think it might help. I want to anyway. And then I'll return to think about actually what's happening. I'm going to play the saraband from Bach's Fifth Suite for unaccompanied cello. Very thanks to a kind donation of the cello to play. And just one thing about it is that for anybody who knows about these things, the top string, which is normally tuned to A, is in this piece tuned down one tone to G. The purpose of that is to create a darker sound. So, I bring it into contact with the strings. But where then is the music? Does it lie somewhere in between me, my bow, and the cello? Would we say that, I can't draw this, that here's me and here's the cello, and somehow the music is inside that relationship between subject and object? Is that where the music is? And clearly not. Or could we say that the music begins with a sound image in my mind and ends in the reverberation of the instrument? Again, certainly not. Rather, the point of contact between bow and strings is the site from which the music pours forth. So, here's me, here's the cello. The music is pouring forth from that site, just as in that diagram there. Likewise, calligraphy pours forth from the site of contact between brush and paper. So the movement of making does not lie in the relation between one thing and another, between the mental image and the material object, between a sound image in my mind and the piece of music, as though it were such an object, but is a movement orthogonal to this relation. On the one hand, of sensory awareness, and on the other, of material flow. And this is the movement of life itself, and it is the creativity of this movement in the process of improvisation rather than abduction that I sought to recover. I'm going to draw just one more picture again because it helps. That suppose so much writing is in terms of the relationship between image. So here's an image in one's head, and here's an object. And so much writing is in terms of this endless shuffling backwards and forwards between image and object. But really, the image is just a moment in a flow of sensory awareness, which goes on. And the object is just a moment in the flow of materials. And so, instead of moving back and forth between image and object, I want to move along those two parallel strands of material flows and sensory awareness. I'm turning the thing upside down, or turning it on its side, if you like. Now, the implication of this argument is that we need to find a new way of thinking about the senses, one which does not repeat the mistake of art historians and theorists of the visual who have written volumes on the cultural history of vision, based on the assumption that to see is to inhabit the domain of images. For students of the visual, these are visual theorists and art historians, seeing apparently has nothing to do with observation, with looking around in the environment, or with watching what is going on. Nor does it have anything to do with the experience of illumination, of light, which makes these activities possible. Vision rather has to do narrowly and exclusively with the relations between objects, images, and their interpretations. Where there are no images to view, for the art historian, there's no vision. It's as though the eyes opened not upon the world itself, but upon a simulacrum of the world whose objects already bear witness to the experience of sight and return that experience to us in our gaze. We cut adrift in this world of images, in which all one will ever see is itself a reflection of vision. The viewer seems blind to the world itself. Now, a principal claim of that field of anthropology, known as the anthropology of the senses, is of course to have dethroned vision from the sovereign position it had allegedly held in the intellectual pantheon of the Western world, and to highlight the contributions of other non-visual sensory modalities, above all to the sensory formations of non-Western peoples. And it's therefore ironic that in rediscovering these modalities of hearing, touch, smell, and so on, anthropologists of the senses have implemented exactly the same manoeuvre as have their intellectual bedfellows in the study of visual culture. To the worlds of images conjured up by art historians, they have simply added worlds of sound, worlds of feeling, and worlds of smell. And a symptom of this manoeuvre is the multiplication of scapes of every possible kind. If the eyes return the world to us in its visual image, conceived as a landscape, then likewise the ears reveal a soundscape, the skin, a touchscape, the nose, a smellscape, and so on. But in reality, of course, the environment that people inhabit is not sliced up along the lines of the sensory pathways by which they access it. It's the same world, whatever path they take. But these multiple scapes don't actually refer to the practically and productively inhabited world. They refer to the virtual worlds conjured up by capturing the embodied perceptual experiences of habitation and rendering them back in artificially purified forms for interpretation and consumption. This is what happens in listening to music, for example. When instead of launching your own awareness on the current of sound, as you did just then when I was playing, you purchase the CD from the shop and sit in a darkened room with your ears covered by earphones. Just as the viewer, wrapped up in images, is blind to the world, so too the listener, wrapped up in recordings, cannot hear. Hear in music as an object of consumption. Perhaps I could return to the example I presented in my last lecture of learning to break eggs in a mixing bowl in the course of making an omelette. As you tap the egg against the edge of the bowl, you touch, you listen, and you watch what you are doing. This is not a matter of inhabiting worlds of sense, but of sensing the world. Yet it is precisely these modalities of practical engagement that are missing from an anthropology of the senses that has nothing to say about how people see, hear, and touch as they go about their everyday business, and everything to say about how their experiences of seeing, hearing, and touching feed the imagination and infuse its discursive and literary expression. In the very objectification of the senses, as things that one could have an anthropological study of, it appears that the eyes, the ears, and the skin are no longer considered to be organs of a body that, as it makes its way in the world, attentively looks, listens, and feels where it's going. On the contrary, they have become instruments of playback, capturing moments of experience and relaying them back to a reflexive consciousness for subsequent review and interpretation. It is as though the eye were a camera and the ear was a recording device. My argument is that in being alive, we move forward, sensing the world, rather than back, retreating into worlds of sense that have been artificially reconstructed on the basis of prior experience. I want to argue for a forward-moving anthropology whose temporal orientation is the same as the orientation of the lives it studies. It is to move and think with things rather than about them, and to allow our knowledge to grow and flourish amidst the movements of the worldly world. Anthropology, then, could be the foundation for a new science of becoming. Thank you very much. What's going to happen now is we're going to play some more music. Whilst you think of questions, we shall play. I hope that the rest of the company will kick this off.